Hi, my name's Joel Bokenfor, Business Advisor with Farm Credit Canada. Really excited to be here with you today. We're going to continue our part 2 of this series, Your Path to Farm Transition, The Farmer's Den, where we're going to talk about equity in farm transition. If you see video 1, I borrowed Annessa Good's father, Merle Good, to go through a bit of a plan on how we could look at focusing purely on the farm business and having discussions as a family using a business plan to dictate our arrangements. For part 2 here, we were trying to role play a scenario to go through a plan to say, okay, now we're going to bring in Annessa and start to discuss how we can unpack equity. And to be honest, it was a difficult conversation on a pretend farm. So we had a very hard time even getting to agreement on a made-up farm about what we wanted to do, and we all have strong opinions and wound up in a bit of a scuffle. So it was a good piece, and what we came to realize is that it's something that's so personal. It truly depends on the farm scenario, the fact pattern, really back to the values and goals of the business. So we thought what would add a lot more to family conversations was if we share our learned experience as advisors working with thousands of families across Canada, that what are those key takeaways that we can take away and work on as a plan. So we're going to put this together and package it as a whole group for those key lessons learned. And to start this off, I'd just like to kind of introduce my two colleagues here who are going to talk a little bit about them. Annessa, would you mind introducing yourself as well?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Joel. My name's Annessa Good. I am Southern Alberta's business advisor for Farm Credit Canada, and we're kind of figuring out our own succession plan or roller coaster as that goes, so that provides lots of insight to my career as well.
And Merle, would you mind
Sure. Merle Good, Annessa's dad. Just carrying on this one, I had a background of 32 years as provincial tax specialist with Alberta Agriculture, primarily in business arrangements and tax. In the last 10 years, Peggy, my wife, and I created Good GRS Consulting, which was private sector consulting to families on succession and estate planning on a one-on-one basis. And then just recently, I've retired from that role, but looking forward to doing educational pieces like this one.
And so I appreciate, Merle, kind of the discussion we had in the first one. So if you haven't seen the video from part 1, definitely go check that out. But this will be a little more like a podcast, I think, us discussing and chatting through things for today. I think some of our key goals, we want to talk about the importance of understanding some ag realities when you're talking about equity, right? The difference in cash versus equity, including non-farm children in their understanding, and really digging into why it's so complex to try to do these things. So we got lots of different points we're going to circle through. I know one that I always like to jump straight to is almost looking at the net worth statement. So I know when I open these discussions up a lot, I've always benefited from being able to pull up a net worth statement and say, okay, this at least gives us the base to put some numbers to thing and talk a little bit about what problem are we trying to scope, right? I know lots of parents don't want to solve these things or they don't want to chat about it or put it publicly, but what are we trying to solve? And pulling that balance sheet that we've talked about together. So I always look at it, right? If we've got a farm, and I think for us, we're going to use a grain farm and follow that grain farm example. And we put a small business asset sheet together of, right? It's a farm with $7 million in asset, just under $2 million in debt, right? If we highlight that, if we're giving that all to the farm child, right, we're probably going to have some issues. If we're splitting it in two and dividing it halfway, it might not be viable for our farm. So these are a lot of the issues that people have to think about. And Merle, maybe you could recap our discussion on the OpCo and real estate company that we talked about in the first video.
Sure. I think with a farm is we have to categorize what we own into 3 pots. Pot 1 is our operating assets. There's a grain farm, of course, it's grain, equipment, inventory. Then our real estate business, which is the land in this case. Then our off-farm investment pot. Our potential retirement income, Canada Pension, OAS, do we have stocks in the stock market? If you have those 3 bubbles, then you can focus on them in different times of our transition. So the previous video was the operating plan, how to make that work. And then the next one is the real estate, and then the off-farm investment decision. So we talk about equity. The thing I always tell the families when I meet with them right off the bat, farming is an equity game. Every dollar you make gets plowed back into assets to create the cash flow. So unless you're in it for equity, it's not necessarily the best business to make as your career, right? And so when we talk about transition on equity, I think on the equity piece, what I want to say is 2 points. One, parents You have to decide a certain part of your career when you no longer take returns out of the farm as labor or management return, but rather redemption of equity. What does that mean in English? It means either the company be buying back your preferred shares. It's either taking and having income out of the investments for retirement, or the third part is selling land. Do you sell land to your company? Do you sell land to the farm child? Or in some cases, do you sell land to a third party purchaser to meet your goals and objectives? That one is very hard to do. I understand that. I'm a farmer. But that's what equity means to me. So from that discussion, we'll talk about what we mean by this equity conversation of land value as the elephant in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, absolutely. And Annessa, you're coming in this originally, I think, to play the kind of, right, the quote unquote role.
Off-farm.
And I think you're stronger personality than either one of us, right, to kind of stand your ground on stuff. So we both were too scared to go to the table with you. But
you think you're scared?
yeah. Well, you got to live it later. So
I know, that's what I'm scared about.
Car ride home. Car
ride home.
But I wonder if, like when you're thinking about, like from all your discussions with non-farm kids too, I guess what comes to the table for helping them understand as well?
Yeah, certainly. I know something all of FCC's advisors, we talk about it as a national team, is, are we, our off-farm children having a chance to be heard, be introduced to the topic of transition? Certainly we're having, in the industry, I think we're starting to have these conversations earlier and earlier. And so the exciting part of that is bringing those voices to the table. And so I think, Joel, when you talk about sharing your net worth, if it's a conceptual example that you talk through with an advisor, or if your family is at the stage where, they share the net worth with the off-farm children as well, it really allows opportunities to see, the current debt load is supported by the current asset allocation. And, we hear a lot, we need to educate our off-farm kids. What does that mean? Is that a fair... When we talk about fair versus equal, we're going to talk about that a lot today. It's not just dollars. Are we being fair to them with that knowledge? Are we being fair to them with acknowledging what they're going to say? So today, looking forward to digging in with a little bit more context. So for example, right on the net worth, Joel, you talk about the debt obligations, and often when I'm sitting with farm families, repurchase impacts come up, right? And so in your opinion, what does that mean? Like how can we support families to start this conversation?
Yeah, so I always go back to that financial tool. Like I think it's so powerful. And this is honestly, it is stealing your words a little bit on, do they understand, does everybody understand the ag realities we have? I always put it back to that financial statement that you're coming back to the farm. Why are you so, right? You're looking for clarity because you're intuitively understanding that these numbers are right, they're stretching out as assets increase in value, as the dollars that we use to generate our income are growing relative to what we can produce. And so I like to come back to it with a bit of a financial plan so that you've got that financial indicator. And we went through a number of different scenarios in that first video, but I always look at it a little bit that if you've got your sales revenue and you're really looking at your margins and things like that, in our example, we're leveraging almost $8 million in assets to generate about $200,000 in net income back to the farm for living costs. Right about 40% of that whole pot of a $2 million generation in revenue based on $8 million in assets. We have about 40% left to make sure we've got our equipment payments covered, that we've got our principal, interest, future borrowing ability covered, some land rent and living costs out of that, and making sure we've got some risk in case things fluctuate, right? So you see a lot of that next gen struggling to say, how do we actually piece this together? And I need clarity sooner rather than later. So putting it on paper helps everybody get to that understanding, helps you share it with the non-farm siblings to say, right, this is why things might not be completely equal to get here.
But I'm going to push back a little bit on this, because you show this statement to somebody, not necessarily in your case or example where Annessa was involved in the farm a little bit, but you show this to somebody who's got a salaried position in Red Deer, and they see $8 million of net worth, and you're saying you're struggling? Come on, man. I mean, like, what are you talking here? So sometimes this idea of bringing out an actual statement of the parents, right? I'm going to come back, maybe just push back a little bit, say, what you mentioned, maybe it's a conceptual balance sheet.
Right.
So you're not showing the actual numbers yet, because once this comes out, this is law. right? Like this
Right.
is your farm. So I think when you bring this conversations, I always talk about off-farm children and farm son or daughter who's farming. We're going to talk concepts today, not necessarily actual numbers.
Right.
Actual numbers to the previous video was very important to look at the business viability and where we're going as parent versus there. But when talking to an off-farm child, be careful, because they're not going to, once you start talking about ROI and EBITDA, they're going to go, huh? And I'm not saying they're ignorant, just that they're not in this space. And they're going to say $8 million of asset. You tell me we can't afford to give me X amounts to raise my kids. I mean, you're helping Joel raise his career. Why in the hell aren't you helping me pay for my kids? Right. So I think you got to be careful of when we take these words of advice from a group of consultants like this. Each family is different. Right. You have to decide if their other off-farm children are well versed in financial management, great. But if they're not, be careful of putting things out that are hardcore numbers, right, rather than conceptual numbers. No problem here, conceptual numbers, saying like, for example, if you want to buy a quarter section data, Joel, what's your capital to gross revenue number, right? It's if you take a $1 million quarter, if you gross 100,000, it's $10 of capital to $1 of income. Right. Conceptually, that hits home now. Like, you mean you got to spend $1 million to make that? Then when you go back into living costs, maybe it's maybe it's not 10 to 1, it's 40 to 1. Right. So you can say, would you rather have a briefcase, or would you rather have a 40 to 1 capital business to make a living?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think point well taken. I think every family's different, and we start with those expectations early. That right, you want to be careful how you set precedent a little bit when you have these discussions. Right, is why it gets so difficult, and that we're going to a place where no one's owed a farm, right? Like it's something we're making choices as we go forward.
Correct.
Yeah, and I think, completely agreeing, and that's why I said conceptual at the start, but I also think when we're sitting at the tables, we're working with a lot of senior generations that they want to be more proactive, or in their words, be more open or do better than the secrecy or previous culture that agriculture sometimes has had with secrecy and things like that. And so it is really finding that balance. And I think, what I really hit on is ages and stages, right? So Joel, in your first video, you talk a lot about what's our family values and vision to the business plan. But I think that's really important too. If we're starting these conversations early, it's dependent on age and stage. You might be 35 years old, but if you've only been back on the farm 2 years, that's different than if you've been back at 21. Right? So once again, why when we started out with this role play, we really struggled, because it is very dependent on each family and their own scenario. Yep. So definitely, I think, what we can really take from this slide and working with this financial reality, something I know we're all really passionate about, is who is on your family farm transition team to support you. So if you don't feel confident enough to work through some of these numbers, or you want to benefit from that neutral third-party advice or insight, certainly, this is a great exercise to work with your accountant and come back and say, okay, once we're working with our accountant to look at our financial reality, then we're coming back and saying, okay, how do we benchmark, right? Where is our farm surrounding, and FCC has a new benchmarking tool. There's certainly other organizations out there that have benchmarking. And again, that is another opportunity from why I'm at the table today, to bring that awareness to non-farm kids. And, again, how do we slow this conversation down? So definitely an umbrella concept is that the fair market value of land, is so far from the return or the productive value of land. And so again, if we say that statement so simply to an off-farm kid, what does that mean? So digging in, Joel, you already talked about it, right? $8 million of equity, $200,000 of living costs. In your guys' example from video 1, that was for 2 generations. That does provide clarity to me as the off-farm child that there probably at this point in time isn't capacity for me to come home, right? If that was a goal to join the business potentially. And so going one step further, Joel, what would be a summary of financial issues to address in farm family conversations that we know and have to recognize are compounded in agriculture?
Yeah, and I think your comments are spot on. And so they're like, when we get to that financial piece, I always come back to, you're trying to unpack the stress on people's mind a little bit. Like, it's not just you struggling with this decision alone. It's all farms trying to figure this out, right? You touched on our asset values have increased relative to what we're capable of producing on that, right? Yeah. That adds another layer of challenge onto the succession planning, right?
Huge.
I would argue, Merle, right, that over your career, right, it's probably getting more difficult.
Well,
to
it
do
is.
some of these things,
I mean,
right?
the discrepancy between what the assets are worth and what it can produce used to be years ago, and it hasn't changed much. It's 2% on assets, right?
Yeah.
So, like you take your 8 million times 2% is 160. That's probably what's left over, when you're all done. So it hasn't changed. It's been better the last 4 years. And historically, what's interesting, back in the 80s when I first started, if the son come home, we'd say, the old joke was, do you like your off-farm son? No. Or, sorry, like your farming son? No. Good, give him the farm. So it was, back then it was tough in the economic capacity. So now there's been a lot of room. That's why succession is so powerful in the ag community, is that there is room to come back and grow these businesses, right?
Exactly.
But and just this idea of the real estate wealth. And I think we need to jump ahead to that a little bit and say, what happens to this land that's worth all these millions?
Yeah, and I want to finish the financial ones before we
Yep,
come
okay,
back to that
sure.
one. But just like the other pieces that we see, I think are stressors are these ones that farms to maintain their current size to keep up, right? Really put some pressure. So they're looking, what's the opportunity, what's the plan, right? There's a bit of challenge from the next gen to say, like, we gotta get going, figure this out. And oftentimes a lot of farms are in a place where they can expand and they can pick things up to go. So, right, it's hard not to look over the fence a little bit and say, it seems like they've got it figured out. Can we do it? And so these things come up financially for everyone, but the things every farm, no matter size, I think addresses at some piece of this as well.
Right. So when we talk about expansion, the only thing I can talk about that from my perspective is two things, right, as a consultant later in my life. Every generation thinks expansion can be acquired through debt capital. Right, let's go buy another quarter section for $1 million. Right, let's go buy the rental land for $1 million. So sometimes I think, based on this cycle where we're at, like when I was in the last 20 years, the industry has faced nothing but reduced historically low interest rates, high commodity prices. That was a no-brainer to expand on capital assets. So now I think the next risk is going to be, how do we actually do the management expansion? Right, we talked about in the previous video. I know we're a little off topic here about equity, but that's a little bit going back, is saying that if we're going to try, like going back to my comment about how parents retire, this I want to focus on. Are we going to focus on returns from the business, or returns from the land, or returns from the off-farm asset pot, right? Because unless I feel security that my retirement's coming from the business, right? If I know I'm going to make my living in Canada Pension, OAS and stuff from there, then normally I'm going to leave my off-farm investment pot, try to be fairness to my off-farm child. That's been a historical thing forever. The elephant in the room is that pot is this big, and the land is this big. So that's what we're going to discuss as we go forward, right? Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay.
Thanks for telling me 20 years ago land was such a good investment.
I wish I'd have bought more too.
No, absolutely, right. And I think that labor and management piece is so critical these days too, that see that as well, that addressing in these succession plans, right? Like that, you want that management piece to be bring in to, we talked about it in the first video, ask yourself what you can do for the farm to improve your skill set. People coming back into the business are incredibly talented. I think no matter who you are across the board, that they're bringing real skills in that need to be recognized as part of this too, so that we are addressing, right? There's a lot of stress that goes on with managing this business as you go forward. And is that worth equity, that you're growing equity for mom and dad as well? So, I know there's a lot of other concepts. I guess, what are some things coming to your mind on the financial piece, Annessa?
Yeah, and I think, when you're talking about the complexity or the size and scale, like when I'm sitting down at farm tables, like I just take a moment and I'm like, okay, everybody breathe. Like, let's let our shoulders drop, and, having that recognition and awareness that, the current senior generation are looking at transferring an operation that is much more complex with corporations, and the tax implications and all of that than they went through when they took over from their parents, right? And so when we kind of take that moment to check in and have empathy from both generations, come on, Dad, hurry up. What's the plan? I got to know, right? I can also take a moment and say, like, okay, it's not like they're doing what's been done before. This is the first generation going through this size and scale of complexity.
Or he just got the farm himself, maybe, right? And he's saying, I've been, I got
Yeah,
to be a manager for 5 years.
I give you 5 years.
Generation.
So the joke I used to have in my succession planning was that at least the previous generation, my dad's generation, had the decency to die young, compared to each one. Peggy's dad, for example, is 93, right? So just the difference in that kind of a joke.
But what, we really want to highlight, I think, with all our discussions about how do we be proactive, how do we learn from the prior generations, language I use all the time is figure out at home first. So when you're talking about your financial implications, Joel, discussions, not decisions, we need to figure out the financial implications of the family's transition plan before we can start talking about expanding to third-party assets. So Dad kind of started to touch on it, right? Parents' retirement income, living income, whatever language makes you feel better. What percentage of that is coming from the farm, and then the allocation of the buckets that Dad talked to. And then certainly, are we budgeting for any capital purchases, right? Do mom and dad need to move to town prematurely for health concerns? Junior generation, do we need to build a residence for them? We all know that residences can put a lot of financial strain on an operation as well. And then lastly, what is the ramifications of their estate plan? So we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but that's the elephant in the room, fair versus equal. Joel, we looked at the net worth statement prior, so can you dive into that now a little bit about the implications of that?
Yeah, I think so. Like in that example we showed, giving it all to one person, right, is right. I mean, there's right that I see some people that support that with their business goals. That's what they choose, and always the caution there is always right that if that's your choice, and everyone, you don't owe anyone a farm. You don't do that. You want to look at people's success on their own a little bit, I think. But I see some farms that go down that path where they're saying we need to leave a bulk of assets here because our goals are to support the farm going forward. And they say, well, you have other children that might cause you some issues down the road that you might want to bring them. If I think this might even be language I'm stealing from you, but right, if it's not going to be equal, maybe we should explain why it's fair and at least hear that out. Or else on that piece, if we divide it purely in two, we go back to that financial one, and it's going to have significant implications to continuing the farm business. And I think we see arrangements from the past too where that's happened, and it's almost like we've put so much rebuy onto the next gen as they come in, right? They're set up to fail from the beginning. So we got to balance these two things in mind. And we are talking about generational wealth is the other difference, that people bring this generational wealth in, that a lot of sacrifice has gone into things historically, where we sacrifice to build equity in the short term, we sacrifice to build it in the longer term.
So I think what I want to end on this equity thing is put it in categories. There's heritage wealth. Heritage wealth is the wealth that families have created to the time the son or daughter comes home. Right? I think we got to sometimes break this up a little bit. So the heritage wealth, to my point of view, has always been that's divisible by how many kids you have if you wish, right? Because that's the business, that the heritage wealth that was created. The next double is the wealth that's created in the family farm with the son, second generation or daughter, being there for the next 25 years.
Right.
Who really owns that equity? Just because it's illegally owned by the parents doesn't necessarily mean it's really rightfully theirs to distribute as they see fit. So I think that conversation has to come forward. We talk about putting the equity into different pots. Heritage equity, farm equity, off-farm investment wealth. Put those in different pots to decide how you divide it. Right. Instead of a template off Excel. So I think that's kind of another concept I'd like to get across today, is maybe the different categories of equity.
Yep. Yep. And I think, right, that speaks to that, right? If they came back, as in our first example, as an agronomist or something, they're adding a lot of value back to that business to discuss. Right.
So I think that for the off-farm kids, they kind of have to understand that value is when even though you're not necessarily part of the company right now, really what I'm trying to get across to my parents is saying, have you ever heard of a word called trustee? Well, yeah, that's a trust. No. A trustee, that's technically correct, but are you not holding these assets really in trust for that next child, right? Next generation. So you're actually not transferring legal ownership through a trust, but you're actually saying to them, I'm going to hold this, so you have to trust me that our plan that we're agreeing to will become yours eventually in ownership. So that's what I'm trying to get across, is value. Because I have off-farm kids saying to me, okay, you just told me you can't afford to give me nothing, right? But you're making $100,000 a year on the farm, right? You got a half-ton truck to boot. You got all the gas you can use.
All the perks.
All the perks. Your kids are in hockey. I can't afford to put mine in hockey, right? And so where's this idea of being fair? Not only are you going to get the vast majority of wealth, but you're also getting income through your career that's above mine and my wife's income. So how do we address that, you two?
Which is, I think, I'm sure you can speak to this more than me, but that is a pivot that wasn't when you talked about the 80s. right?
No.
Like that, to what you're speaking almost is like good old sweat equity. The
Right.
farm couldn't afford to pay you an income,
Right.
right?
Right.
Now, what you're saying is
In
that
some farms, like larger grain
a grain
farms,
farm
they're
example.
getting their sweat equity formula is really deficit, not a credit. Like
Right.
they're getting paid more maybe in some ways through cash to live on, but also potential growth in the company through common shares. So if the off-farm kids are saying to me, well, yeah, but, so we can have all these conversations, but the yeah, but's going to keep coming up.
Right.
And so that gets back to, I think, some of the stuff we have to talk about is
that's just focusing on labor though,
right.
right?
But I mean, the management side, I mean, I realize what I'm trying to say is that the farm child is getting value in labor, cash to spend on their
Right.
living costs, plus they're getting, in most cases, returns to management and expertise and enthusiasm. Now, if they're not getting that, then the value formula is in a deficit position. So all I'm saying is we have to, too many times people say, second generation says, I'm not being paid enough. And then if I'm not getting all that though, that's what I'm trying to get across. There's got to be more than the old way of thinking was value is only hours of labor.
Yeah.
And it's not areas of management. And
It's expanded now
yeah,
to
so like
include.
Yeah.
on your farm, you're an agronomist. So what does that mean?
Yeah, well, I think that bringing that back to it, I think there are ways that we would look at it and say, yeah, is there value that's happening that we're increasing beyond what happened? Now that we have two people in, generally that we're excited, happy to work together, that we tend to see a kick up in growth potential, right? As there's more bodies to make decisions, you tend to see that farm equity growing a little bit and some enthusiasm. To your point, let's keep going.
So here's an idea as we're kicking around. Maybe we need to talk about is when you say what's your returns from the farm, it's 60,000. That's labor.
Yeah,
So then as an off-farm child, you're saying, hey, I'm making 80, man. I'm doing good. Now,
Right.
if you want to make that extra 40, are you running a business?
right. And is that coming from
I'm,
management?
do you want to put in the hours to be a manager, risk taker on debt? Do you want to have all those things? If you want to put all those things
Right.
back, well, that's the other 40,000 that I've earned.
Yeah.
So that'd be kind of a neat conversation as we're talking about what's your salary out of a business or what's your take out of business. Well, it's 60,000 salary and 40,000 management and risk.
Right.
So then when you can explain,
risk.
so you explain that back to your off-farm sister or brother, you're saying, do you guys want to do that?
Yeah.
And they're
And
going, no, well, I'm not putting those kind of hours in or taking that kind of risk.
Yeah.
Like my brother would never farm. Arlen would never come back to the farm because he can't handle the risk.
Right.
And I think it is important, even though we're talking about that involvement, and into this management, that there are certainly, we're talking about a green farm in this, there is some industries, right, where certainly there is tighter cash flow, so sweat equity is still a critical part
Oh, sure.
of that compensation,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And I think everyone, like we always say, that's why it was so difficult for us to try to role play this, is that everybody's value system is going to be a little unique in that, right? So
Yeah,
how you allocate that's up to you.
for sure. And so when we talk about buying out siblings or anything like that, when we were looking at the financial statements, this is definitely where we're always balancing the teeter-totter, right? So of the financial or tax plan balanced with the family goals and what's unique to them. And so when we talk about what that buyout can be and then balancing that out. So if we're talking about a buyout, there's lots of different scenarios, and that's what we hope to highlight a bit today. We're not going to offer solutions, but talking about some considerations. So, how does this impact the family relationship? I'm going to speak more to the soft side. If there is a debt owing between the siblings, for 15, 20 years, what is that buyout? Because we know in agriculture, we need time. So from the farming child's perspective, you have this constant IOU. I got to give the check to my off-farm sibling. And then from the off-farm child's perspective, it's saying, okay, what is my security, right? Who is my farming brother going to pay back first? A third-party institution or myself? And, is that income really transforming my life? So those are certainly some things to think about.
Yeah. And I think to your point, right, a lot of assets in that mix do go to people that aren't coming back to the farm, right? People are solving their own puzzle, so lots do come back. And on that point for the equity, right, it becomes, when you're the next gen coming in, I think the shift is trying to let them know what's expected so we can build it back into our financial plan for how we're going to do disbursements to redo those things and how we agree and relationship wise, right? How do I deliver the rent check or the buyout check to a sibling to make sure they understand where it's coming from, right?
Right. So this all bases back, sorry to kind of come back, bases back to the question I've asked throughout my career in 32 years. If I opened up a current will, what percent of Central Alberta farmers or grain farmers are leaving some of their land to off-farm children? It's been as high as 85% and hasn't changed in 25 years. So to get to the elephant in the room, I think we've got to realize that land is going to off-farm children because of the wealth inside the land value. How much is, that's a discussion. So if we say, yes, it's happening, then the next question comes back is, let's not fight it, let's embrace it, and let's discuss it and get the best objectives of what that transfer of equity is all about. And that gets back to a concept of looking in, getting back to your idea of saying, how about the debt? Well, if my parents transfer a quarter section to my off-farm brother, and I am expected to buy that off him, right? What's it for? Is it for income or wealth? And I'm gonna speak a little here. If it's for income, then I like the idea of, you just mentioned receiving rent. There's nothing wrong with, the trouble with all the will playing I see is land's going to an off-farm child when mom and dad are dead. Well, that creates no sibling interaction. Why not have this when the referee's still alive? So why don't we transfer this land, and we can do it different ways, control mortgages or whatever, but transfer the land to the off-farm child when they're 35, whatever, so they are part of the family farm. They grew up on that farm. Transfer them a quarter section, right?
Yep.
But then have some restrictions and some covenants. The restriction is the company gets to rent it, right, while the parents are alive. Could you imagine, Joel, you taking a check to your brother who's off-farm and say, here's your rent check. It may not be 20,000, maybe 10, right? But if the farm can't afford to reward land ownership, then how's it going to reward it when I die? So what I want people to do is start proactively doing equity transfers and the consequence of equity transfers on land while they're alive. I like your point about being a referee, because you're saying you own a part of the pot, it's heritage farm, you get part of that quarter that was heritage land, you get to do it, but the business needs access. So access versus ownership is a concept that I really want to stress in our discussion today. You don't own every acre on your farm. You have access to 40% of your land is rented. So what's so wrong with one of your landlords being a relative, as long as what is the expectation?
Yeah.
I always laugh, when I was doing this stuff, you guys, when I was your age, was that, here's the deal. If I give a quarter section to my farming child and he sells it in 5 years, what is he? Well, I can't say it on the video, right? But it's not very good.
Yeah.
If I give a quarter section to my non-farm child and they sell it in 5 years, they're a great investor. Well, if the value of the farm is to hold patient capital, that's the word I want to come up with in this video, is patient capital. We need to have understanding that land is a patient capital asset. If it isn't, then realize it's an income asset.
Right. And that clarification gives everybody certainty, and I agree on your point, right? Knowing that ahead of time is going to set you up for success as a family long term, right? That we just put it in the will and we don't tell anyone is going to be.
Well, if you do that in the will, then it won't last. There won't be this understanding of what's happening.
And certainly, you kind of talked about that $10,000 or that timing, whatever that value is. And in the next pathway video, we're going to talk about, what is the value of $1? And again, coming back to timing of your life, right? $10,000 when you're 35 means much more than $10,000 potentially when you're 75, right? So having that conversation. And something else, we really wanted to highlight today, again, coming back to, we're not solving them. And the three of us, when we were prepping, we all kind of put our head in our hands and said, like, no wonder, we go in circles with this as families because it's tough decisions to make. But we wanted to highlight today, regardless of a buyout or transferring farm assets to dividing between your children, in this brainstorming phase, there's some critical questions that, again, me representing the off-farm child's perspective. And so first one, the big one, what happens if the farming successor quits farming, right? Generally, the plan we're creating with our team of advisors of what our family deems as fair, it's a great plan. However, what happens if, successor prematurely passes away, disease, disability, perhaps that larger chunk of assets, is that now converted wealth to income through land sales or things like that? Certainly difficult to assess. Second critical question from the off-farm perspective is with the example farm you guys used in your first video, there was a large percentage of rented land.
Yep.
Right? Which is certainly something in the prairies we see. And, you know, I'm having lots of conversations right now with farm families of, you know, what if we can't purchase that rented land? It's not financially feasible for us to come up, and or we lose it. So second critical question, if we lose rented acres and our business is once again no longer viable, how is our fair versus equal division of assets play into that? And lastly, the one we wanted to share with you today is something, you know, both Joel and I will ask families we're working with, how many generations are you planning for to the senior generation? So again, completely dependent on each family. Some families we worked with, they say, I'm just planning to my children's level. Others will start to take into account that next generation of grandkids and cousins. And so again, often complexities of fair versus equal is, well, the farming child's children could potentially be multimillionaires in the future if they don't continue to farm. And obviously the off-farm children will not have that same opportunity. So again, you know, we realize that we're highlighting these main issues, but something we talk about a lot, again, we're broken records, but it's because we want to drive it home. If we're proactive planning, it's not as personal. If we wait to react to scenarios or ideas, then of course it does become personal. And so really, you know, what we talk about in our meetings is the gift of choice. So going back to, you know, Joel, your comment of what is my financial reality if I'm the farming child? Is there any opportunity for me to have some input or be heard from the off-farm child? And then allowing us as the siblings to have some choices in the parents' proposal, I think allows us to have ownership of that plan as well. And so, Joel, do you want to talk about, I love your word, mind monsters, and what that is?
Yeah, and so I think you said it pretty eloquently there, that that's exactly the reason why that everyone goes off with their own story and makes up a fact pattern of what happened in this arrangement, right? And you start to see, right, the monster builds in your mind a little bit of, and you're like, well, that's not really how it happened, right? You're putting it back out there, like there was a story behind this, why we did this. We thought about the farm plan. We wanted to see this continue. Or, right, as a parent, mom and dad felt this was a more fair solution or more equal solution, and starting to put those scenarios out there that as a family, we're doing our best to make small decisions at the start, and then we get better at making bigger decisions as we go along on this fair and equal part. And that's where I find people, they're looking for these solutions to unpack these issues. And if they can start doing some small decisions together, then as they progress, the bigger ones get easy and they kind of get to a place where they get comfortable making a choice. But everybody understands what's happening, and we're in a safe place to have that discussion rather than I'm going home and I'm getting real angry because this didn't go the way I wanted.
So let's challenge you guys. You're the second generation farm son and let's say an off-farm daughter. So there's a quarter section for sale.
Back into our role play, hey?
Yep, quarter section for sale, and it's cost $1 million. Basically, just all discussed about, you know, the off-farm daughters and they're going to have a harder time to make a living maybe than you are, and you know, on and on and on. So let's do a real example. It's going to face all of our clients. There's a quarter section for sale in your area for $1 million, right? Do we buy it, or do we assist our off-farm daughter with transformational income today? What do you think?
Yeah, so I'm going back.
So first of all, explain.
Well, I'm playing off-farm child.
Yeah,
I know what my answer is.
But explain. Like I wanted to come back and say, what I'm trying to get across
this is your choice.
I know, but I'm saying, like, if I can give, if we buy the quarter, it's $80,000 a year coming out of, or $60,000 coming out of our pocket to buy the quarter.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, who's the quarter for? I'm 64 years old, right? And the trouble is, a lot of successful generation my age, they never give up wanting to expand. Right, it's in our blood. You know, we're develop. Like I think Elaine Fraze says, we're the developers or the guys that started these things. We want to keep growing. But when we look back at the family goals rather than just the business goals, my question always is: with this kind of land value, are we better off to spend $60,000 a year on buying this quarter, where that in the will you land up happen to buy 3 quarters off her for $3 million? Or are we better off to say, you know, let's have this hard discussion, and if we don't buy this quarter and we got $60,000 of extra revenue for my retirement and to help Annessa with her living costs for the next 20 years, maybe that's a discussion we have to have. That if we do that to help you, it's called transformational. It's kind of like impact, right? If I give you $25,000 a year out of the farm tax-free through my shareholders loan, right? That's a huge impact on your family. You can educate your
100%.
kids, you can buy your RESPs, get ahead in life, right? So I'm helping you get ahead a lot quicker than maybe leaving you a quarter section in the will worth $1 million that you can't sell for 30 years because you got to rent it to him for 30 years. So I'm just trying to come back and say,
Yep.
you know, I think we have to challenge our thinking with the way the economy is for off-farm people. The cost of housing, right, and this kind of stuff. So I'm just kind of thinking back, before we always look at the expansion of the business, we need to come back and look at what are we trying to accomplish in the next 5 years.
Yeah. And
Right.
in our family goals, right? And,
Yeah, so
and
that's what I'm
why,
coming back about, do we buy the quarter? Like put it back into reality, right?
And that's why I wound up in the headlock last night as we were discussing this, right? That
Yeah.
we had different opinions on that, and it came down to saying, okay, mom and dad, now which hat are you putting on, right? Are you saying, as a family, this is how we see it, and then right there is there is absolute justification for that, how you want to proceed to support your children out of the business, and then knowing that, I think ahead of time, this is where I always see them go bad, is that right, we're saying we can do both, right, and we can't do both, right? So
Right.
we have to, I think, deciding these things proactively and
What's the highest
intentionally.
priority at this time?
Right.
Like you said,
What's
ages
important?
and stages. I kind of like that comment, ages
Yeah.
and stages. So if you're, you know, 30 some years old, or excuse me, you're 21,
Yeah, thank you.
that makes me only 54 now. Good deal. So I'm just meaning like that kind of deal, we come back and say where we are at stages and ages, what's the next best place to put our cash flow and capital?
Right.
And then if we have, do we have some time left here?
Yeah.
I think we're running a
We're
little
running,
tight.
we're running
So-
tight, but,
so-
and are they going to do good things with
Right.
that
So
gift?
the
right?
last one is, we're now seeing farms with 2 to 3,000 acres of owned land. So, you know, we're talking before about, you know, parking so much millions here and then giving a quarter section. That's on a small farm. But if we're talking 15 quarters, right, even if we talk about giving the daughter 1 quarter and he gets 14, that ain't going to happen either.
Yeah.
So one thing I'm going to end up with is something that you and I did a lot of work with when you were with Alberta Agriculture, and I just wanted to bring this forward to the audience across Canada, is looking at co-ownership land models.
Right.
You know, whether we have a land capital partnership where we're going back and saying maybe 4 of those 15 quarters go into a jointly owned land capital partnership where that Annessa owns it, you own it, if you had more than 2 siblings, 2 other daughters own it, and the deal is that's for long-term wealth, and it's going to have not a 5-year lease agreement to OPCO, maybe a 25-year rolling lease. You know, that this capital is not sold until the last spoken for is farming. So that's called long-term patient capital. So that idea, what I come up with when we worked together in Alberta Ag, was to come back and say, maybe we need to look at this long-term capital preservation where that no one gets to sell it, but everyone gets to get their rent off it, right? So you're getting your returns to your land wealth, but it's not sold. It's almost like some of these trusts they have in the US where they don't have a 21-year limit.
Right.
So to me, on larger farms, we're going to have to look at that, maybe not all of it, of course, but a part of it where it's strictly going to solve that issue. If Joel doesn't farm 40 years from now and his kid sells out, well, there's 5 quarters worth $5 million that the family has still inherited
Right.
as a land corporation, land capital partnership. So maybe we'll do a video on that someday.
But we do have to look at things differently because I think the
Doesn't-
elephant in the room of land values and quota or anything else, right, are continuing to be more complex. So, Joel, why don't you speak?
Wrap it up.
Yeah. So I agree, right? And then if you're not there, right, you might have to look at bringing in partners as well.
Yeah.
In terms of, right, what others, or we talked about what other business, and maybe we're more like a family bank that allocates out how we do things and how we spread capital across our family members. And the trouble with those ones, as we know or we've discussed, right, is
The governance
is
of that, right?
governance, right? So this is where I see them go off the rail, is how do we sit down and agree to own stuff together?
Yeah.
It better be our choice, not mom and dad's choice. It better be a decision that we want to be involved in together, and that we've effectively got strategies to deal with all those things of who gets to work outside the partnership, or does the partnership do everything together? Becomes so critical to try and implement those things that the more I see in practice, it gets to be right that there's got to be a real true understanding, and true governance becomes important.
Yeah, the only one I've only seen 2 written up really in long detail, both out of Saskatchewan, and that's the issue. You know, like Dad and Mom are trying to set the rules of the partnership right now. Then what's the rules going forward?
I think we highlighted the complexity of why we couldn't just add a short conversation in terms of adding that wealth bubble, because it is so fact pattern dependent and value driven
Absolutely.
that it becomes a real difficult puzzle to solve. I don't know, I think we're good on kind of closing comments, but truly appreciate the support and backup on this one. I've learned so much from both of you in these conversations too, that really appreciate it. Thank you, Annessa and Merle, for joining us on this one.
My pleasure
had a lot of fun.
doing stuff with education. That's great.